Imagine walking through the streets of medieval London on execution day, where the air is thick with excitement and anticipation as thousands of people abandon their daily work to witness what they consider the ultimate form of entertainment. Children run alongside adults carrying picnic baskets, vendors hawk food and ale as if preparing for a festival, and families secure the best viewing spots hours before the condemned is even brought to the scaffold. What you're witnessing isn't a somber religious ceremony or solemn dispensation of justice, but a carnival atmosphere where human death has become the centerpiece of mass entertainment, complete with cheering crowds, betting pools on how long the victim will take to die, and commemorative souvenirs sold to mark the occasion. The medieval public execution wasn't just about punishment. It was a carefully orchestrated social event that revealed the darkest aspects of human nature while serving multiple functions that went far beyond simple criminal justice. The transformation of death into public spectacle represented one of medieval society's most disturbing cultural institutions, where the systematic killing of human beings had evolved into elaborate theatrical productions that could draw audiences larger than any religious festival or royal celebration. Public executions weren't random violent events, but carefully planned entertainment spectacles that required extensive preparation, professional management, and sophisticated understanding of crowd psychology to achieve their desired effects. The execution site would be transformed into a temporary amphitheater, with viewing stands, vendor stalls, and designated areas for different social classes, while the timing and choreography of the execution itself were planned to maximize both the victim's suffering and the audience's emotional engagement with the spectacle. The economic infrastructure that supported public executions reveals how death had become a profitable industry that generated significant revenue for communities while creating employment opportunities for dozens of specialized professionals. Master executioners commanded fees equivalent to skilled craftsmen's annual wages, while the construction and maintenance of execution equipment required carpenters, metal workers, and other artisans who developed expertise specifically in building instruments of death. Local merchants would stock up on food, drink, and souvenirs weeks in advance of major executions, while innkeepers and tavern owners could charge premium prices for accommodation and refreshment during execution events. The economic impact was so significant that some communities would compete to host major executions, understanding that a spectacular death could bring prosperity to local businesses. The social hierarchy that governed public executions demonstrated how even death was subject to medieval society's rigid class distinctions, with different execution methods, locations, and ceremonies being reserved for different social ranks. Nobles faced the relatively merciful beheading, often in private courtyards with only select witnesses present, while commoners were subjected to hanging, burning, or other prolonged forms of death in public squares where maximum crowds could observe their suffering. The most elaborate public executions were reserved for those whose crimes had captured public imagination or whose deaths served particular political purposes, with these events being planned months in advance and promoted throughout the region to ensure maximum attendance and impact. The role of children in public executions provides perhaps the most disturbing insight into how medieval society viewed violence, death, and moral education, with parents routinely bringing their offspring to witness executions as essential educational experiences that would teach them about justice, morality, and the consequences of criminal behavior. Children were encouraged to watch closely as victims died, with adults explaining the theological and moral significance of what they were witnessing while treating the human suffering as an object lesson about divine justice and social order. Some execution events included special educational components designed specifically for young audiences, with simplified explanations of the victims' crimes and the religious significance of their punishment being provided by clergy or other authority figures. The religious framework that justified and sanctified public executions reveals how medieval Christianity had been adapted to support systematic violence through elaborate theological arguments that portrayed public killing as divine will manifested through human institutions. Priests would deliver sermons before executions explaining why God required the death of the condemned, while the execution itself was presented as a sacred ritual that cleansed the community of sin and demonstrated divine justice in action. The victims' final moments were carefully scripted to provide opportunities for confession, repentance, and spiritual redemption that were portrayed as divine mercy rather than recognition of the obvious cruelty being inflicted. Church authorities taught that witnessing executions was a form of religious devotion that brought spectators closer to understanding God's justice and the consequences of sin. The psychological techniques employed to maximize the impact of public executions demonstrate sophisticated understanding of mass psychology and crowd manipulation that turned individual deaths into collective experiences that could influence public opinion and social behavior for years afterward. The timing of executions was carefully planned to coincide with market days, religious festivals, or other occasions when large crowds would already be gathered, while the selection of victims and the nature of their crimes were chosen to resonate with contemporary social anxieties and political concerns. The execution process itself was choreographed to build tension and emotional engagement, with dramatic pauses, speeches, and ritual elements being inserted to heighten the psychological impact on spectators while ensuring that the victim's death achieved maximum symbolic significance. The vendor culture that surrounded public executions created a bizarre economy of death, where human suffering became the foundation for commercial enterprise, with entrepreneurs developing increasingly creative ways to profit from the public appetite for violent spectacle. Food vendors would develop special execution day menus, featuring items with macabre names or symbolic significance, while souvenir sellers offered everything from pieces of the scaffold wood to alleged personal effects of famous condemned criminals. Some vendors specialized in execution-related merchandise, selling miniature gallows, toy weapons, or pamphlets describing the crimes and final words of notable victims. The most enterprising merchants would establish permanent stalls near popular execution sites, understanding that regular executions provided reliable customer traffic and profit opportunities. The crowd dynamics of public executions reveal how normal social constraints could break down during these events, transforming ordinary citizens into participants in collective violence that went far beyond simply witnessing state-sanctioned killing. Spectators would often throw objects at the condemned, shout abuse and encouragement alternately, and compete to get close enough to touch the dying person or collect blood and other bodily fluids that were believed to possess magical or medicinal properties. The execution crowd developed its own culture and customs, with regular attendees forming informal social groups that would gather for major executions while sharing information about upcoming events and comparing the relative merits of different execution methods and performers. The aftermath of public executions was often as disturbing as the events themselves, with the victim's body becoming the focus of continued violence and exploitation that could extend for days or weeks after their death. Body parts were harvested for supposed medicinal or magical purposes, with executioners often supplementing their income by selling pieces of the corpse to customers who believed that materials from executed criminals possessed special powers. The scaffold and execution equipment would be dismantled and sold as souvenirs, while the execution site itself often became a pilgrimage destination where people would gather to commemorate the event or seek spiritual benefits from proximity to the location where divine justice had been dispensed. The international variations in public execution customs reveal how different cultures developed their own traditions and techniques for transforming death into public entertainment, with each society adapting the basic concept to fit their particular religious beliefs, social structures, and aesthetic preferences. French executions emphasized theatrical elements and dramatic timing, with elaborate processions and ceremonial speeches that turned the event into grand opera. German executions focused on mechanical precision and efficiency, with sophisticated equipment and procedural innovations that minimized the risk of botched killings that might reduce the spectacle's impact. Italian executions incorporated artistic elements, with beautiful scaffolds and ceremonial decorations that made the execution site itself an object of aesthetic appreciation. Spanish executions combined religious fervor with extreme cruelty, creating events that were simultaneously celebrations of faith and demonstrations of institutional power. The seasonal scheduling of public executions demonstrates how these events had become integrated into the rhythm of medieval life, with authorities timing major executions to coincide with agricultural cycles, religious calendars, and social events that would maximize attendance and impact. Spring executions were often scheduled to coincide with planting season, symbolically representing the cleansing of the community before new growth began. Summer executions took advantage of good weather and increased travel to draw larger crowds from surrounding regions. Autumn executions were timed to occur after harvest, when people had more leisure time and disposable income to spend on execution-related entertainment. Winter executions were relatively rare, but were sometimes used for special effect, with the harsh weather adding to the victim's suffering while creating more dramatic visual elements for spectators to appreciate. The impact of public executions on community mental health reveals how regular exposure to systematic violence affected the psychological well-being of entire populations, creating societies where extreme cruelty became normalized and even celebrated as essential components of social life. Children who grew up attending executions developed different attitudes toward violence and death than those raised in more peaceful environments, while adults who regularly witnessed public killing often showed signs of desensitization that affected their capacity for empathy and moral reasoning. Some communities reported increases in domestic violence, animal cruelty, and other forms of aggression following major execution events, suggesting that public violence created psychological conditions that encouraged additional cruelty in private settings. The medical knowledge that was gained from public executions represents one of the few arguably positive outcomes of these systematic killing events, as physicians and anatomists took advantage of the regular supply of fresh corpses to advance their understanding of human physiology and disease. Public dissections were sometimes performed immediately after executions, with the anatomical investigation being presented as an extension of the educational value of witnessing the criminal's death. However, this medical benefit came at enormous human cost and was often used to justify the continuation of public executions long after their supposed deterrent value had been questioned by legal and social reformers. The political dimensions of public executions reveal how these events served as demonstrations of state power that went far beyond simple law enforcement, functioning as carefully orchestrated displays of governmental authority that could influence public opinion and international relations. Major executions were often timed to coincide with political crises or diplomatic negotiations, with the spectacular death of high-profile criminals serving as implicit threats to domestic opponents or foreign enemies. The selection of execution methods and the level of ceremony surrounding particular deaths conveyed specific political messages about the government's strength, resolve, and willingness to use extreme violence to maintain control. Foreign ambassadors and visitors were often specifically invited to witness executions, with the goal being to convince other nations that challenging local authority would result in consequences that transcended normal diplomatic or military retaliation. The technological innovations that were developed specifically for public executions demonstrate how human ingenuity could be systematically applied to perfecting the spectacle of death, while maximizing both the victim's suffering and the audience's engagement with the event. Improved scaffold designs allowed for better crowd visibility and more dramatic presentation of the execution process. Mechanical devices were developed to ensure more reliable and spectacular deaths, while timing mechanisms were created to coordinate multiple executions or to create dramatic pauses that would heighten tension and emotional impact. Some communities developed signature execution innovations that became tourist attractions in their own right, with people traveling significant distances to witness particular types of death that couldn't be experienced elsewhere. The documentation and commemoration of public executions created an entire literary and artistic culture devoted to celebrating and preserving the memory of spectacular deaths, with broadsheets, ballads, and illustrated accounts being produced to extend the reach and impact of execution events beyond their immediate audiences. Professional writers specialized in execution literature, creating standardized narratives that emphasize the moral lessons and entertainment value of public killings, while often fabricating dramatic details to enhance their commercial appeal. Artists created execution imagery that could be sold as standalone entertainment or incorporated into larger artistic works that celebrated the triumph of justice over criminality. This documentation industry ensured that the psychological impact of public executions extended far beyond their immediate witnesses, influencing public attitudes toward violence and justice across much broader geographical and temporal ranges. The decline of public executions came not through sudden humanitarian awakening, but through gradual recognition that these spectacles were becoming politically counterproductive and socially destabilizing, rather than serving their intended functions of deterrence and social control. As societies became more centralized and governments developed more sophisticated methods of maintaining authority, the need for dramatic demonstrations of state power decreased, while the risks of large, excited crowds gathering in public spaces increased. The rise of professional police forces and more efficient criminal justice systems made the deterrent effect of public executions less important, while changing religious and philosophical attitudes made the theological justifications for spectacular death less compelling to educated elites. Economic factors also played a role, as the costs of organizing major public executions became harder to justify when the same resources could be devoted to more productive social investments. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how the history of public executions reveals the extraordinary human capacity for transforming systematic killing into entertainment and moral education, demonstrating that even the most fundamental taboos against violence can be overcome when cultural institutions provide appropriate justification and social support. The fact that entire communities could gather to celebrate the death of fellow human beings, while maintaining their sense of moral righteousness and social responsibility, shows how completely ordinary people can be conditioned to participate in systematic cruelty when it's presented as necessary for justice, order, and spiritual welfare. This historical example serves as a powerful warning about the potential for violence to become normalized and celebrated when societies prioritize abstract goals over individual human dignity and welfare. What do you think about this absolutely horrifying demonstration of how entire societies could transform systematic killing into mass entertainment while convincing themselves they were serving justice and moral education? Can you imagine living in a community where bringing your children to watch people die was considered essential parenting, and where the death of fellow human beings became the centerpiece of social gatherings and economic activity. The fact that intelligent religious people could participate enthusiastically in these spectacles while maintaining their sense of moral superiority really makes you wonder about the psychological and cultural factors that enable populations to celebrate violence when it's given official sanction and ideological justification, doesn't it? Share your thoughts in the comments about how contemporary entertainment and media might be continuing some of these same patterns in more subtle forms, and what this reveals about the human appetite for violence as spectacle. If you found this investigation into the dark social reality of medieval public executions as disturbing and relevant as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking revelations about how supposedly civilized societies have historically transformed cruelty into culture and violence into virtue. Ring that notification bell, because our next deep dive will explore another example of how human communities can normalize extreme violence when it serves perceived social functions. Trust me, these stories will change how you think about the relationship between entertainment, morality, and systematic cruelty forever.